Hi, and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in films, television, and in books. And today's video is going to be about symbols, recurrent symbols, and the importance of them in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. In particular, I'm going to be focusing on Deadhouse Gates. So, one of the things about this is obviously I did a close reading of the one of the symbols in Gardens of the Moon, looking at the weather vane in Moxhold. That's a close reading. And I did a close reading of part of the aspects in the prologue of Deadhouse Gates. But beyond that, obviously, one of the literary devices that Erickson uses in the Malazan Book of the Fallen and other authors use is using images, recurrent images, that symbolize something beyond a simple description. Very straightforward. Everyone does it. It's a standard literary device, but it can add a lot to your reading if you pay attention to it. So, like a very clear example of this is the spinning coin that people hear in Gardens of the Moon. Any readers of The Wheel of Time will recognize that as very similar to the sound of rolling dice that the character of Matt has in The Wheel of Time. That we have this recurrent symbol throughout the series that signifies something more than just describing a sound. It has a deeper meaning, it has a greater meaning, and it has to do, in both those instances, with elements of chance. It's no more important than that. It's no less important than that. It's an additional thing. So at this point, I wanted to recommend that if you're at all interested in sort of the literary techniques that Erickson is using in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, go to Balastad Books YouTube channel, where she is going through a first-time read of Gardens of the Moon, chapter by chapter, and she's doing a very attentive reading, very careful reading. Slightly different from close reading. Close reading is a specific thing, and she certainly exhibits a lot of elements of that. But she's a professional editor. She's an English professional. So seeing how she goes through and how she reacts to the literary techniques and what is on the page in Erickson's Gardens of the Moon will give you a really good idea of what attentive reading can be when you're going through the book. Because so often when we read, we treat it as a passive experience, that we're just tripping along with the story. It's just being told to us and we don't necessarily engage with it. Whereas reading is quite often much more rewarding when it is an active process, when you're actively engaged. And one of the criticisms, obviously, of Malazan, and I'm sure if you're watching this that you don't agree with it, is Malazan is difficult, Malazan is hard, Malazan is complex. Malazan is good writing, and good writing challenges the reader to engage. And one of the reasons why we sometimes find it difficult is we've gotten so used to stories being told to us instead of stories being shown to us, and we then have to decode and engage and sort of give life to the story in our own minds. And one of the aspects of this, the one that I'm going to talk about here, is symbols in Deadhouse Gates. So obviously, the opening of Deadhouse Gates, by the way, this will contain some spoilers for Deadhouse Gates, just in case you're confused. I don't want to ruin the book for you. If you haven't read it yet, turn off now. I'll hopefully see you in another video. But if you've read Deadhouse Gates or are going to be doing a reread, think about, in that close reading I did of the prologue, those symbols of death, those symbols of dying. And when I was talking about it in that close reading, it was very much, again, focusing on the Empire. But when you look at Deadhouse Gates and you see the chain of dogs, when you see the wounds that are being inflicted and it's taking a long time for them to die, think of the dog that is dying, or the donkey, the mule that is dying. Could they be saved? Because they're not dead yet. So we have this symbol that at the beginning, obviously, I was applying to the Empire, saying it is sick, it is dying, it's in its death throes, but it's not dead yet. And that's an important consideration, particularly considering the chain of dogs, that we could apply that same symbol and look at it as constructing a theme about something that is wounded, something that is dying, but there's still a chance to save it, even though it's diseased. And when we couple that with the image at the very end of the book with Mappo running after the cart to heal the two dogs that should be dead, that are clinging on to life by their little tiny paws, that there's a chance to heal. There's a chance for renewal of life. And then we think of Felison's story, where Felison is wounded time and time again and is tortured through the course of the narrative. And at the end, has a chance for rebirth, both with Auden's death in her lap, which cracks the armor that she's used to protect herself. And suddenly her inner self is being exposed to these feelings that she's tried to hide away from, that she'd been dying a slow death, all of her humanity stripped away. She'd been dying by inch and inch, getting closer to no longer being human, no longer being alive, simply existing. And suddenly there's a chance for rebirth. And then with the engagement with Shaik, with the engagement with the whirlwind goddess, that it is not the goddess simply taking over, but a partnership. That we're left with, and I know this is just for Deadhouse Gates, but we're left with a potential hope for Felison in this book. So again, tying into that image of being tortured and being killed and dying, but not dead yet, that there's still life. And where there is life, there is hope. And of course, this goes to Erickson's overwhelming theme of compassion and empathy that runs throughout the entirety of the Malazan Book of the Fallen, that we are being forced to consider this, that he's not presenting an easy judgment. He's not dictating to us how we should feel. He is showing us these things and asking us to engage. So let's move on to different recurring symbols in Deadhouse Gates. Think of the flies in the prologue and all of the different aspects about disease and death that were associated with the flies. And then think of the cape moths and the rhizan, the flying lizard things that are eating the cape moths, and the butterflies. That is a constant theme coming throughout the entire novel. All of the chain of dogs, this constant reference to these flies, to these insects, and how they are feeding off the dead. This cycle of death and rebirth. That ties in to what I was discussing with Philip Chase, in regards to the cycle of death and rebirth of civilizations, the cycle of death and rebirth of peoples, of tribes, of humanity, that we are locked in this cycle of destruction and rebirth. And we see this time and time again when Felison and Taborik and Culp discover the abandoned city. What we see here is the fall of a civilization. You know, we can go back to that famous line from the poem, I am Ozymandias, king of kings. Look at my works, ye mighty in despair. You know, when we see that classical image of those recumbent, what Felison thinks are statues, and then it turns out it's the people of a civilization that fell, that they died, they were destroyed, the civilization was destroyed, but there's still life. We still have koi in the koi pond, or the fish in the pond. We still have the fruit trees, and it gives life and succor and help and support to Hiboric and Felison and Culp. But coupled to this, obviously, we have this whole thing about Icarium, and Icarium going through on his journey, where we find out he is both a benefactor to places as well as the destroyer of places. Again, this whole idea of cyclical time, where time continues to evolve, but then returns on itself. And again, people familiar with the Wheel of Time are obviously going to be familiar with this idea of cyclical time, of time going through this repetition of civilization growing, it reaching its apex, and then dissolving or being destroyed, and then a new civilization arising again and again and again. So we can bring that all back again to this idea of the insects that recur throughout. They are feeding on the dead. They are this sort of pestilent horde plaguing them. But at the same time, they have discovered a bounty of new life, which in turn inspires the predators that feed on them to have a bounty of new life, which the predators that feed on those. And to quote the Lion King, it's the circle of life that Erikson keeps bringing us back and connecting all of these images, these symbols, which are describing what is happening, but at the same time have these additional meanings that link up thematically the various story threads that we have in Deadhouse Gates. And then think of one of the other aspects of the story, one of the other symbols of the story that becomes so important for the entire Malazan Book of the Fallen, and that's of chains, the chain of dogs, this idea of chains recurrent throughout Coltane's march. And then we see it in reference to the Toblakai, and we see it in Felasin being chained at the very beginning. And then we see it metaphorically in the chains that Felasin has bound herself in. And again, this idea, taking a very simple image, something that, we read and we go, oh yeah, that's a nice metaphorical, she's bound herself in her own chains. And when we start to make those connections throughout the text, we suddenly realize the depth and complexity and intricacy of what Erikson has woven into the entire narrative. These things are not happening by accident. It's not that he only had one image in his head and went, I'm just going to keep sticking it in. These things are placed very deliberately. And so while the chains in Deadhouse Gates obviously have certain meanings, as we read through the series, those meanings expand and start to connect to greater and greater aspects of the story. So this is just like a very quick, brief overview, looking at a couple of the symbols. But what I would say to you is, if you're doing a reread or if you're reading any of these books, start keeping an eye out for certain recurrent images, recurrent sounds, recurrent symbols. Start looking for them. And then start thinking about them in terms of, well, why does Erikson keep returning to that? What could these things possibly mean? Why is this in this text? Is it linked to an interpretation of what's happening in that moment? Is it linked to one of the other story threads? Is it linked to a greater theme throughout the entire book? Is it linked to a greater theme throughout the entire series? Looking back on the books that I've previously read, does it connect to other things there? It's just one of the fun exercises that makes reading great literature like this so interesting, because the depth of what you get out of it and how it challenges your perception and it opens your mind to these new ideas and new points of connection within the text. It's one of the reasons why I love literature. So take that as a challenge if you want, but I will see you in the next one.